So most of us spend more waking hours working than doing anything else. And so if the Dharma doesn't touch our jobs, our money, our exhaustion, our compromises, and our survival strategies, then it doesn't really touch our lives. Right Livelihood asks a simple but unsettling question. Does the way I survive cause harm to others, to the world, or to my own heart? And perhaps an even more tender question, is it possible to earn a living without abandoning myself? And before I talk about right livelihood in this series and right livelihood in our complexities, it helps to understand what it is not. The Buddha often taught by contrast. And here the contrast is sometimes called the path rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. That is sometimes called the harmful path. This is the path where survival is driven by fear, or success is measured by comparison. Harm is justified as just the way things are. In the sutta, the Buddha names wrong livelihood as work that directly and indirectly causes suffering. And this was 2,600 years ago. But traditionally, this includes trading in weapons, trading in human beings, trading in meat in exploitive ways, trading in intoxicants, trading in poisons. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper teaching. This rather harmful path isn't only about what we do, it's about how our work trains the heart. Work becomes part of what might be called a harmful path when it requires us to numb ourselves, rewards dishonesty or cruelty, normalizes exploitation, or depends on constant dissatisfaction, or erodes empathy over time. On this path, we slowly harden and we tell ourselves stories like, I don't have a choice, or this is just business. I'll act differently later. And without noticing, the job begins to shape our nervous system, our speech patterns, our relationships, and even our capacity to meditate. As Ajahn Sumedho once said, we become what we repeatedly contemplate. Or you might hear it if you're in the martial arts like Tai Chi. Where the chi goes, the mind follows. Where the mind goes, the chi follows. We become what we repeatedly contemplate. Livelihood is one of the strongest contemplations that we have. One of the reasons that right livelihood feels so difficult today is that most of us do not work in isolation. We work inside systems, economic, political, technological, that distribute responsibilities so widely that no one feels fully accountable. The Buddha did not use modern language like systems or institutions, but he understood collective karma very deeply. Karma is not only individual action, it is patterns of behavior repeated, normalized, and inherited. This matters because many people say, I'm not directly harming anyone, while participating in structures that depend on harming continuing. Right livelihood asks us to look not only at intention, but at participation. So I'm going to mention a few of the Buddha's suttas, and I have a piece of paper I'm going to hand out at the end, so they'll be on there if you want to look them up later, along with a little summary of the talk. But these are some of the suttas that describe skillful livelihood. One of them is the Vanija Sutta. The Buddha names, as I mentioned, trades that cause harm. But notice something subtle. These are livelihoods where suffering must remain in order for profit to continue. Weapons require enemies. Intoxicants require addiction. Trafficking requires dehumanization. So in this first sutta, he names livelihoods that cause harm. But the deeper teaching is not about moral labels, it's about cause and effect. When our survival depends on harm, whether obvious or subtle, the mind becomes unsettled. The heart contracts, not as punishment, but as a natural result. I know this not as theory, but as experience. There was a period in my life when my first full-time job out of college, my work looked completely fine from the outside. It paid the bills, it carried respect, and raised no ethical red flags. And yet, something was happening quietly. My speech was becoming sharper. My body tightened when I thought about work. Meditation no longer settled, not because the mind was busy, but because something underneath was grieving. And when I eventually realized, what I realized was simple and painful. My livelihood required me to ignore what I loved. Not all at once and not dramatically, but day by day. And the mind responded exactly as the Buddha said it was, by growing uneasy, divided, and tired. As Bhikkhu Analayo, a well-known German monk that I often quote, points out, ethical misalignment shows up not as guilt, but as a quiet sense of inner dissonance, a feeling of living slightly out of tune with oneself. This is what the harmful path looks like. It's not always cruel or violent. More often, it's a slow normalization of self-betrayal. When we say things like, this is just how it works, or what choice do I have, or I'll change my actions later. Gradually, work trains us to tolerate disconnection from the body, from empathy, from the heart. Right livelihood begins not with perfection, but with honesty. It begins when we stop pretending that the contraction we feel doesn't matter. Livelihood is simply action repeated day after day. And when the repetition trains numbness or aggression, the nervous system learns that deeply. So translated into modern life, we might ask, does my work rely on people staying afraid, sick, addicted, indebted, or misinformed? Does my way of earning a living depend on the environmental harming being hidden or ignored? Does my job depend on someone else being disposable? These questions are uncomfortable because they implicate us, not as villains, but as participants. The Buddha did not teach this to induce guilt. Guilt paralyzes. He taught us to wake up to causal changes, the causal chains. When we see clearly, we gain options. Maybe not to dismantle systems alone, but to stop pretending neutrality. This is why right livelihood is inseparable from right view, the first noble truth. When we see suffering clearly through the first noble truth, that there is suffering, the idea of just doing my job becomes harder to maintain. And yet this is crucial. The Buddha never demanded that householders or lay people like us remove ourselves from society. He taught discernment, not withdrawal. Liberation is not found in purity, but in wisdom held in the middle of complexity. In another sutta, the Kunda Karamaputta Sutta, the Buddha lays out a deceptively simple framework. Actions rooted in non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion lead toward well-being. It does not require philosophical sophistication, only honest observation. Livelihood is one of the clearest laboratories for this teaching because it repeats daily. If our work continually stimulates urgency or comparison or aggression or numbness, the nervous system absorbs those states as normal. Even when the job appears neutral, the internal training continues. This is why right livelihood can't be separated from mental health or spiritual practice. The Buddha is pointing out that liberation is not only cultivated on the cushion, it's cultivated in emails and meetings, negotiations, deadlines, and compromises. We do not leave karma at work, we practice it there. When I finally turned toward that truth in my own life, right livelihood did not immediately mean leaving everything behind. It meant telling the truth, first to myself, and then about the cost of continuing it as I was. What struck me most was not the external guideline, but the internal consequence. The Buddha wasn't moralizing, he was diagnosing. When our livelihood contradicts our deepest intentions, the mind cannot rest. As Bhikkhu Analayo points out, ethical discord shows up first as mental unease, before we name it as burnout or depression. It often appears simply as the inability to feel at home in ourselves. Skillful livelihood in this sense becomes an act of listening, not to an external authority, but to the body and the heart as instruments of wisdom. The Buddha did not suggest that everyone should quit their job or that only spiritual work is acceptable or that you must feel inspired every day or that you'll never feel conflict. You have to remember that the Buddha taught this path to farmers and merchants, to parents, to rulers and monks alike. And this skillful livelihood is not about purity, it's about alignment between values and action, care and consequence, intention and impact. In the Noble Eightfold Path, right livelihood grows out of right view and right intention. And if we understand suffering and wish to reduce harm, then our work naturally comes into question. The teachings emphasize that right livelihood is fundamentally about not harming, expressed over time. Not a single ethical decision, but a pattern. And there are inner dimensions of livelihood. Oftentimes we might ask, is my job right or wrong? The Dharma asks something subtler. What mental states does this work encourage? What emotions do I have to suppress to do it? What parts of myself are strengthened or diminished? You can be in a socially respected profession and still experience wrong livelihood if the work trains you to manipulate, requires chronic dissociation, keeps you in fear, or rewards aggression. And you can be in modest, imperfect work and still be practicing right livelihood if the job encourages honesty and allows conscience. supports care, or leaves space for integrity. Sayadaw U Tejaniya, a well-respected teacher of Westerners from Burma, teaches that the question is always, what is the mind doing while this is happening? Whatever we're noticing, what is the mind doing while this is happening? Right livelihood becomes practice when we stay aware of greed, aversion, and delusion, noticing what's happening in the mind as they arise in the workplace and choose not to feed them. Greed, aversion, delusion, when we are aware of them and we don't feed them. One of the most painful aspects of wrong livelihood is that harm is often incremental. We don't wake up one morning intending to betray our values. It happens slowly. A compromise here, a silence there, a rationalization offered gently. Over time, we feel tired, cynical, and often disconnected. This is why it's important to view right livelihood as an act of compassion toward our future self. Sister Ayakema warned, if our livelihood contradicts our deepest values, meditation alone will not bring peace. If our livelihood contradicts our deepest values, our meditation alone will not bring peace. It's part of a relational practice. Livelihood is never just personal. It affects co-workers and communities and ecosystems and families. And skillful livelihood asks, who benefits from this work? Who pays the hidden cost? Who is invisible? And this doesn't mean that we must solve capitalism or purify institutions alone. It just means that we stay awake. Joseph Goldstein reminds us that ethics in Buddhism are not commandments but trainings, ways of learning what reduces suffering. Sometimes change is impossible. Right livelihood is not always about immediate external change. Sometimes change isn't possible due to health, immigration status, caregiving, economic conditions that are precarious without predictability or security, affecting material or psychological welfare. In these cases, practice looks like naming harm honestly, reducing harm where possible, not lying to ourselves, preparing inwardly for change. A student came to me once saying very plainly, I understand right livelihood, but if I leave my job, my family won't eat. There was no drama in their voice, just realism. They worked in a system that caused harm, indirect harm, nothing illegal or shocking, but enough that their conscience never fully rested. They felt caught between Buddhist ethics and very real responsibilities, parental care, medical bills, children. The Buddha does not ignore this reality. In another sutta, the Sigalovada Sutta, he speaks directly to householders embedded in economic and family life. He does not demand renunciation. He emphasizes responsibility, fairness, and care within one's existing role. For this student, practice did not look like leaving. It looked like refusing deception when it was normalized, treating colleagues with dignity, naming discomfort instead of numbing it, and using income in ways that supported generosity. The Sigalovada Sutta is sometimes called the householder's code of ethics, and it matters deeply for modern practitioners like ourselves. Here, the Buddha explicitly addresses people who are embedded in family systems and economies and obligations. And he doesn't suggest withdrawal, he emphasizes responsibility, fairness, and mutual care. This sutta reminds us that skillful livelihood is not opposed to relationship or responsibility. In fact, it includes them. Ethical work supports trust, stability, and dignity within communities. The Buddha recognizes that people are supporting children, elders, and entire networks of dependence. And so for those who cannot simply leave their jobs, this teaching offers relief. Right livelihood can mean doing less harm where you stand, refusing to deepen exploitation, and using your role to protect rather than erode dignity. In another sutta, Nibbādika Sutta, the Buddha states clearly, it is intention that I call karma. When livelihood cannot change outwardly, intention becomes the primary site of practice. This does not erase harm, but it changes how harm is met. It prevents the second arrow, the self-hatred and denial that can deepen suffering. Liberation here grows alongside responsibility, not in opposition to it. Ayasantusika, one of my favorite nuns who lives near Santa Cruz, and she teaches that renunciation is not always about leaving. It's often about letting go of the inner contract that says we must betray ourselves to belong. For this student, over time and practice, something shifted. They didn't become happier, exactly, but they became less divided. The work was still imperfect, but the heart was no longer at war with itself. Sharon Salzberg reminds us we don't practice to become perfect people. We practice to become whole people. Skillful livelihood here is about integrity under constraint. It included kindness towards the conditions that we're in, while not surrendering discernment. The Buddha did not romanticize poverty or condemn wealth. He taught that wealth becomes unwholesome when it is gained through harm or clung to with fear. Sometimes in our lives, money carries enormous shame or fear and projection, and many practitioners feel that they have to choose between being ethical and being safe. Right livelihood asks, am I earning this honestly? Am I relating to money with generosity? Does my income increase freedom or fear? Livelihood can be a field of awakening. Work is where patience is practiced, speech is sharpened, and intentions are revealed. Every email, meeting, boundary, and decision becomes part of the path. Another of the suttas, the Sallekha Sutta, teaches gradual training, the willingness to notice unwholesome states without justifying or condemning. In the context of livelihood, this is especially important for those in caregiving and service or helping professions. Skillful livelihood here means learning when to set limits, when to rest, when to stop confusing self-sacrifice with virtue. The training is not to become endlessly patient, but to become deeply honest. Maya Santusika also says, renunciation is not about enduring harm quietly. Sometimes it's about renouncing the belief that our worth is measured by how much we can endure. The Buddha's ethic of non-harming includes the one doing the labor. You might remember in the Karaniya Metta Sutta, which I suspect quite a few of you are familiar with. You might not know it by that name, you might only know it as the Metta Sutta. But it doesn't include us from the wish, may all beings be safe. When care erases the caregiver, harm is still occurring. And in the Karaniya Metta Sutta, it's often recited very beautifully. We do it here sometimes. But it can be practiced incompletely. Its ethical demand is radical, that no being be excluded from care, not even ourselves. In livelihood, rooted in service, this teaching becomes essential. When compassion only flows outward, burnout is inevitable. The Buddha's vision of non-harming is circular, not one-directional. Right livelihood includes the courage to say, this pace is not kind. This cost is too high. Metta is not sentimental, it's protection. When work consistently contracts the heart, it is wisdom that is asking for attention. When change is constrained, integrity still matters. When care flows outward but never returns home, the path has tilted toward harm. Skillful livelihood is not solved once, it's revisited again and again as conditions change and courage grows. The Buddha didn't ask us to get it right forever. He asked us to keep turning toward less harm. And that turning, sometimes awkward, sometimes brave, sometimes unfinished, is itself the path. Joseph Goldstein reminds us the ethical path is not about judging ourselves. It is about seeing clearly, through direct experience, what leads to suffering and what leads to freedom. When livelihood becomes honest, awake, and oriented toward care, work no longer pulls us away from the path. It becomes the path itself. Right livelihood is not a verdict on our worth. It's an invitation into greater honesty and compassion and freedom. The question is not, is my livelihood pure? But rather, is it moving, however slowly, toward less harm and more care? When livelihood becomes practice, work no longer pulls us away from the path. It becomes the path itself. When livelihood becomes practice, work no longer pulls us away from the path. It becomes the path itself. The Buddha taught that the fruits of practice are never only personal. Whatever clarity, courage, or kindness arises here does not belong to us alone. It flows outward into families, workplaces, communities, and into systems that desperately need more care and less harm. So I think I'll end there. Also by saying that if anything I said was confusing or seemed challenging, embrace what you felt is useful and let go of the rest. Some of it may come back as a surprise later when you least expect it. And I would like to dedicate whatever goodness has arisen through this reflection on right livelihood to those who are working under impossible conditions. Dedicate it to those who feel trapped between survival and conscience. To those whose labor is unseen, underpaid, or taken for granted. And dedicate this practice to those who are quietly trying to live with integrity in imperfect systems. May this practice support wiser choices where choice is possible, and compassion where choice is constrained. May those whose work cause harm, often without seeing it, be met with insight rather than disdain. And may those who are exhausted by caring for others remember that they too are worthy of protection, for the possibility of a world shaped by wisdom and compassion. Thank you for your practice. And let's just sit a while and let the words settle down. May we notice our body as it is right now, the weight of the body, the contact with the chair or the floor, the simple fact of being supported, bringing attention to the breath, not to control it, just to feel it, breathing in and breathing out, and gently bring your mind, the mind to your livelihood. This might be a job or caregiving, it could be retirement or seeking work, maybe unpaid labor. Notice what arises in the body when you think of your work. Is there tightness? Is there warmth or heaviness? Is there numbness? There's no right response, simply notice. And now ask quietly, without needing an answer, what does my work ask of my heart? And feel how that question lands in the body. If tension arises, see if it can be held gently. If emotion arises, let it be present without explanation. And now bring the mind to this second question: where does care flow easily in my work? Notice any softening or resistance. And finally ask, where might less harm be possible right now? Just one small step. You're not being asked to solve your life, only to listen. before we close, include yourself in the field of care, silently offering, may I be safe, may I be supported, may I not abandon myself in the name of survival. And return gently to the breath. May our collective livelihood, the way we organize, work, value labor, and measure success, gradually bend toward less harm and more care, for the welfare of all beings, for the easing of suffering. That's our hoppity skippity bell. Thank you so much for your practice. May it bring you joy.